Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are diving straight into, something you might not think about every day, but it has a real impact on how projects, actually run retention in construction contracts.
Retention. It's one of those things, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
a bit behind the scenes, but absolutely crucial to how these big projects actually function.
Yeah, totally. We've got the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, RICS for short. Their practice information document on retention is our guide for today. This document's from 2012, and it sets out best practice in, the property and construction sectors. Really gets into the nitty-gritty.
A deep dive into the world of retention. I like it.
Our goal is to clarify, first of all, what retention even is. Why is it such a common feature in these agreements, and how does it actually work in practice? Across all the different standard contract forms that you come across in construction.
Absolutely. That's the key.
Yeah.
Whether you are, let's say, directly involved in building projects or just fascinated by how these complex agreements work, well, understanding retention it's essential.
So let's get right into it. What is retention in a construction contract? What's the fundamental reason it exists in the first place?
Okay. In simple terms, retention is a percentage, right? A portion of the money that the client holds back from each interim payment they make to the contractor or subcontractor as the project goes along. The main reason for this is to provide, that financial security for the client, just in case any defects, any problems appear after the work is done,
Yeah.
Completed.
Right. It's like a safety net almost.
Exactly. It motivates the contractor, incentivizes them to come back and rectify those issues, make things right should they arise. It's like a safeguard for the client. Bit of peace of mind.
Okay, so it's a percentage of the money that's held back. Is there a standard percentage, or does it vary depending on the project?
Right, yeah. So the level of retention, it's not fixed. It's usually expressed as a percentage of the total contract value. And that percentage, it can differ. It can vary from project to project.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all.
Not at all. Now, the RICS guidance, it highlights that, it's pretty common to see retention set at, a specific percentage, but often there's a maximum cap. For instance, you might see JCT contracts with a cap of, say, 3% or 5% of the total contract value, the whole sum. But the crucial point is that those specific details, the percentage and any maximum limits, they absolutely have to be clearly defined in the contract particulars.
So the specifics are always spelled out in the contract itself.
Exactly. No room for ambiguity there.
Okay, and what happens when the construction work is physically finished? Is the contractor, do they get that retained money back right away?
Well, not typically. You see, the release of that retention money, it usually happens in two stages. Okay, so often about half of the total retention, that's 50% in a lot of, standard contract forms, it's released when we reach what's called practical completion.
Yeah, practical completion.
Practical completion is, it's essentially when the main construction work is finished to the point where the client can actually use the building or, the infrastructure. The remaining half, the rest of that retention money, is then typically released after what we call the defects liability period.
Right, the defects liability period. That's the period after completion where the contractor's still responsible for fixing any little snags that pop up.
Exactly. It's a set period where they're on the hook, so to speak, for any defects that might appear. Once those defects are all sorted out and the certificate of making good defects is issued, that's when the final chunk of the retention money gets paid.
Okay, so two-step release. One at practical completion and the other after those snags are addressed. The RICS guidance also mentions something interesting. They talk about alternatives to, physically holding back cash. They specifically mention retention bonds. Can you explain how those work?
Sure. So retention bonds, they offer a different way to provide that security for the client. Instead of the client literally holding back, physically holding back a percentage of each payment, what happens is the contractor provides a bond, a financial instrument. It's usually from a bank or an insurance company, and it's made out to the client.
So it's like a guarantee, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. That bond is a promise. It says that the bank or whoever's issuing it will pay the client up to a certain, pre-agreed amount if the contractor doesn't come back and fix any defects. So the client still has that financial protection, that guarantee.
It sounds like that could be, much better for the contractor in terms of their cash flow because they're not actually having money withheld from them.
Absolutely. It can be a huge benefit to their cash flow.
Yeah.
It doesn't tie up their working capital in the same way. And there's definitely a growing push toward using retention bonds, especially in public sector projects. But, it's worth noting that cash retention is it's still very common, and there can be some, debate around, just how secure are bonds and the administrative side of things compared to that simple cash retention.
Right. The traditional way has its own pros and cons as well. Okay, so we've covered the general principles, kind of the what and the why of retention. Let's get a bit more specific now. How is retention applied in different standard forms of contract? Let's start with the JCT suite, the joint contracts, tribunal contracts. These are, they're some of the most commonly used contracts out there, aren't they?
Absolutely. The JCT contracts, yeah, they're everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
The JCT produces a whole range of standard building contracts, and how they approach retention can actually vary quite a bit depending on which particular JCT contract you're using.
So it's not a uniform approach across the whole JCT suite.
Right, exactly. There are some key differences to watch out for.
Okay, so let's start with the JCT standard building contract with quantities. That's a big one, right? How does retention work in that particular form?
Yeah, so in the standard building contract with quantities, there's often the option of using a retention bond, that alternative we discussed. That option is usually specified, is clearly laid out in the contract schedules what the deal is. And the default percentage for retention, well, that's also stated in the contract particulars.
So those two key pieces of information, they're right there in the contract documents.
Absolutely, front and center. Now, something interesting with this contract, and actually many other JCT contracts, is that if the project is completed in stages, what we call sectional completion, well, the initial release of retention, that 50% that often gets released upon completion, it's actually it's proportional to the value of the section that's been completed.
Ah, okay. So it's not just a blanket 50%. It's 50% of the value of that completed section.
Precisely. And then the remaining retention that's released once the certificate of making good defects, that all clear on the snags, is issued for the whole project.
Okay, so it's tied to the completion of each stage, essentially.
Right.
Yeah, so there are some nuances there in how they actually calculate it.
Definitely.
Okay, what about the JCT minor works building contract? This is the one that's specifically for, smaller scale projects.
Yeah.
Is the approach to retention similar in that form?
So with the minor works building contract, a retention bond, that's not typically an option. That alternative we discussed, it's not usually on the table.
Yeah.
And again, the default level of retention, the percentage, well, that's all going to be in those contract particulars.
Okay, so similar to the standard building contract in that sense.
Yes, similar there. Now, with minor works, sectional completion, completing the stages, that's not usually a feature of those types of projects. So the initial 50% release, it happens upon practical completion of the whole project, the whole thing. Yeah. And, as usual, the final release happens after the certificate of making good defects. Straightforward.
Okay. What about the JCT intermediate building contract? Where does that one fit in?
So the intermediate building contract, it's similar to the minor works contract in that a retention bond, again, is not usually an option. You're generally looking at that cash retention. And, as always, the default retention percentage, that's all going to be spelled out in the contract particulars. But unlike the minor works contract, sectional completion can be a feature in intermediate projects. So if it is, then that initial 50% release of retention, well, it happens upon practical completion of, each of those sections bit by bit. And then the final balance, the rest of the retention, is released after the certificate of making good defects for, the complete project.
Yeah. Right. So it can have that staged element to it if the project itself is done in stages.
Precisely.
Okay. And just quickly, what about some of the other less common JCT forms like the prime cost building contract or the management works contract? Any major differences there in how they approach retention?
Right. Well, in the prime cost building contract, retention, it's often set at 3% of the contract value, as stated in the particulars, and a retention bond, you guessed it, it's not usually a possibility.
Sticking with the cash retention.
Yeah. The release follows the standard pattern. 50% upon practical completion, or, if it's a sectional completion situation, proportionally for each section, and then the rest upon the certificate of making good defects. It's pretty consistent. Now, with the management works contract, a retention bond is actually an option.
Oh, interesting.
But it's only for those individual, those separate works contracts that kind of make up the overall management contract, the bigger picture. The default retention level there, it's typically 3% as per, as stated in those specific works contract particulars. And again, that release follows the same familiar pattern. 50% upon practical completion of the works, subject to sectional completion, if that's the case, and then the final 50% upon getting that certificate of making good defects for those specific works. Across all these JCT forms, it really boils down to this. The contract particulars, that's where you find all the nitty-gritty details about retention. The percentage, any caps or limits, anything specific to the project, that's where it's all laid out.
So really important to scrutinize those contract particulars.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now. Let's talk about the NEC engineering and construction contract. This one, I understand it takes quite a different approach to retention.
Oh, yeah. The NEC ECC, it's a whole different ballgame. You see, under the NEC ECC, retention, it's not automatically included in the contract.
So it's not a given.
No, not at all. Whether retention applies at all, it depends on the specific options that are chosen when they're putting that contract together.
Okay, so it's much more, I guess, customizable in that sense.
Yeah, you could say that. It's more of an opt-in system.
Okay, can you break down, those different options and how retention is actually handled in each of them?
Sure. So for NEC option A, which is, a price contract with activity schedule, and option B, which is a price contract with a bill of quantities, and also those cost-based options, C, D, and E. Well, retention, it's not the default. It's not automatically there. So if the parties involved, if they want to have retention, they have to specifically select what's called option clause X6.
Okay, so they have to actively choose to include it.
Exactly. And then, the specific details about, what's the percentage, is it a fixed amount, and how does the release work, all of that, it's all stated in the contract data. Now, something really interesting with NEC is that under some of these options, the retention, it can actually be defined as a fixed fee amount, like a specific sum of money rather than, the typical percentage of the payment.
Oh, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, it's quite a departure from how other contracts often do it. There's also this thing called a maximum retention limit, but that only really kicks in if the contract is specifically, amended, changed to include it. So it's not always there. Now, option F, which is, that's a cost reimbursable contract, it also deals with retention through an option clause. So again, it's not just baked in as standards.
It's all about choice.
Yeah, flexibility. And the specifics there often, it's a fee amount with a potential maximum. All of that is, again, detailed in the contract data. It's all spelled out. Now, generally speaking, the NEC suite, it often favors the use of performance bonds as that alternative to traditional cash retention. That's something they tend to lean towards.
Okay, so much more, I guess, choice and flexibility with the NEC ECC. It's not as prescriptive as some of the JCT forms.
Right, you could say that. Okay,
so, we've gone through quite a few different contract forms there, and it really highlights just how important it is to thoroughly understand the specific terms of the contract you're working with, because, they can differ quite a bit.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The devil is in the details with these things.
Yeah, 100%. All right, let's move on to, I guess, some of the more practical considerations, some of the common issues that tend to pop up around retention in real-world construction projects. What are some of the typical problems that can lead to, delays in getting that retention money released? Because that can be a big headache, right?
Oh, yeah. Delays, they're a common issue, unfortunately. And they often arise from ongoing defects that the client feels haven't been properly resolved, or from disagreements between the client and the contractor about whether, certain issues are actually the contractor's responsibility, or whether the work they've done to fix things is actually good enough.
So it's often those, I guess, those gray areas where there's not a clear-cut answer.
Yeah, those areas of judgment, they can definitely lead to disagreements and delays.
Okay.
And that's why clear communication, consistent communication, it's really crucial. Having a well-defined process for identifying defects, addressing them, and certifying that they've been properly rectified, That's key to preventing these sorts of holdups. It's all about clarity and communication.
And, what about the financial side of things? What about the impact of retention on a contract, their cash flow, particularly for those smaller businesses? That can be a real concern, right?
Absolutely, it can be. Retention can have a significant impact on cash flow because, well, a portion of their earnings it's just tied up. It's held back for what could be quite a long period of time. And for those, for smaller, medium-sized contractors, that can really put a strain on their working capital.
Makes it hard to keep things running smoothly.
Exactly. And, there's also the inherent risk that, that the employer, they could actually become insolvent before that retention is released.
Yeah.
And if that happens, well, the contractor can find themselves in a very, very difficult financial situation.
It's a risk that contractors have to be very aware of.
Yeah, it's something to consider carefully. On a more positive note, though, the RICS guidance, it does point out that JCT contracts, they often stipulate that if the employer is a local authority, they have to place those retention monies in a separate bank account, which offers a degree of protection in that particular scenario.
Right. So there are some safeguards built in
Correct.
certain cases.
Yes, thankfully.
Okay, final question on this topic of, kind of common issues. What about latent defects, those hidden issues that might not become apparent for years after the project's finished? Does the typical retention mechanism, does that provide security against those sorts of defects?
Generally speaking, no. No, it doesn't. You see, retention it's primarily there to provide security against what we call patent defects. These are the defects that are visible or should be reasonable discoverable at or before the time of completion. Latent defects, those hidden ones that pop up much later, they're usually dealt with through separate legal provisions and often have much longer liability periods that extend well beyond the typical retention period. It's a whole different area.
So it's not a catch-all solution.
No, not at all. Different tools for different problems.
All right. Well, this has been a fantastic, really thorough overview of retention in construction contracts, drawing directly from that RICS guidance. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground here. To kind of sum it all up, retention, it acts as that financial security for the client against defects. It's that money deducted from interim payments and then released, usually in stages linked to practical completion and the end of that defects liability period. And we've seen how differently retention is handled across, all those different standard contract forms like JCT, NEC, FETI. Each one has its own little quirks. And on that note, here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Given the growing interest in those alternative security measures, things like retention bonds, how might that traditional, that practice of cash retention, how might that evolve in the future of construction contracting? What innovative approaches could emerge to better balance, that need for client security, that peace of mind for the client with, also ensuring that contractors are treated fairly financially and have, a healthy cash flow. It's a really interesting area to keep an eye on, especially as the industry continues to change and adapt. So much is in flux at the moment. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into retention.
It's been a pleasure. Lots to think about.
Always is. Until next time.